The pursuit of power almost never originates from a position of strength, but rather from a profound, often subconscious perception of inadequacy that demands external validation. When an individual feels an internal deficit in their ability to influence their environment or secure their status, the psyche initiates a compensatory drive to acquire symbols and behaviors associated with dominance. This reactive state creates a fundamental paradox where the very act of reaching for power serves as a primary indicator that the individual currently lacks it. Because the desire is born from a sense of being under-resourced or overlooked, the resulting behavior is inherently defensive, characterized by a hyperfixation on how one is perceived rather than the actual exercise of competence. The cognitive origin of this drive lies in the brain's attempt to bridge the gap between a fragile self-image and the demands of a competitive social hierarchy. Instead of developing genuine agency through the slow accumulation of skill and character, the individual shifts their energy toward the construction of a persona designed to intimidate or impress. This shift marks the beginning of a self-defeating cycle, as the mental resources required to sustain this performance are diverted away from the very qualities that would provide actual stability. By centering their identity on the acquisition of power, the individual inadvertently anchors their self-worth to a shifting external landscape, ensuring that their sense of security remains perpetually out of reach. Once the compensatory drive is activated, the cognitive architecture begins to prioritize the maintenance of a formidable exterior over internal coherence. This process involves the constant monitoring of social cues and the meticulous calibration of one's posture, tone, and presence to project an image of unshakable authority. However, this level of constant self-regulation imposes a massive cognitive load, forcing the brain into a state of permanent hypervigilance. The individual is no longer interacting with the world directly, but is instead managing a complex simulation of themselves, constantly checking for cracks in the facade and adjusting their behavior to preemptively neutralize perceived threats to their status. This internal management system is inherently fragile because it relies on the suppression of authentic responses in favor of calculated ones. Every gesture is weighed for its potential to signal strength, yet this very calculation introduces a subtle rigidity into the individual's movements and speech. In the realm of cognitive psychology, this is recognized as a failure of fluid intelligence in social settings. The individual becomes so preoccupied with the metagame of appearing powerful that they lose the ability to respond naturally to shifting circumstances. Consequently, the facade of power becomes a prison, demanding total devotion and leaving the individual with no psychological reserve to handle genuine crisis or connection. True authority is characterized by its lack of visible effort, a state of psychological grace where influence flows from presence rather than performance. In contrast, the seeker of power operates with a high degree of social friction, where their intentions are constantly leaking through the seams of their manufactured persona. This leakage occurs because the human brain is highly evolved to detect incongruity between verbal signals and nonverbal cues. When someone tries to be powerful, their movements often lack the relaxed economy of someone who actually is. They might overcompensate with aggressive eye contact, an artificially deepened voice, or a physical expansion that feels forced rather than settled. This friction acts as a loud social signal that broadcasts the individual's underlying anxiety to everyone in their vicinity. While they believe they are projecting dominance, they are actually signaling a desperate need for the environment to acknowledge their status. This neediness is the fundamental antithesis of power, as it grants the observers the very thing the seeker wishes to take, the ability to validate or invalidate their existence. By trying too hard to command the room, the seeker inadvertently becomes the most reactive person in it, their every move dictated by the shifting gaze of others, revealing a profound lack of autonomy that is visible to the intuitive mind. Observers do not need to be trained in psychology to sense the uncanny valley of performed power. It is an instinctual recognition of a threat that doesn't have the substance to back it up. When a person's perceived status is entirely dependent on their performance, they trigger a sense of distrust in others, as the inconsistency between their projected image and their true state creates a feeling of psychological dissonance. Superiors sense a lack of genuine stability, peers sense a competitive threat born of insecurity, and subordinates sense a lack of authentic leadership. This collective perception forms a silent consensus that the individual is trying, and in the social hierarchy, the moment you are seen to be trying, you have already lost the position you were trying to claim. This breach in perception leads to a gradual but inevitable erosion of the individual's actual influence. Because they are viewed as a performer rather than a pillar, their words carry less weight, and their presence becomes a source of tension rather than a source of direction. The more the individual senses this withdrawal of genuine respect, the harder they lean into their compensatory behaviors, creating a feedback loop of escalating effort and diminishing returns. They become trapped in a state of perceptual isolation, where their attempt to bridge the distance between themselves and others through the medium of power only serves to widen the chasm, leaving them alone in a theater of their own making. The internal consequence of this prolonged performance is the fragmentation of the self, a state where the individual loses the ability to distinguish between their authentic desires and the demands of their persona. This psychic split occurs because the power-seeking self must constantly suppress the vulnerable self, leading to a profound internal alienation. The individual begins to view their own emotions, doubts, and needs as weaknesses to be hidden or eradicated, rather than as essential components of a functional identity. As a result, they become a stranger to themselves, operating on a set of programmed responses designed to maintain the mask while the core of their being remains underdeveloped and neglected. This fragmentation creates a state of chronic inner tension that manifests as a lack of true conviction. Because their power is not rooted in a unified self, it lacks the weight of authentic character. It is a hollow shell that can be easily shattered by even minor setbacks. The individual lives in constant fear of being found out, not realizing that the person they are most afraid of encountering is themselves. This internal vacuum is the ultimate weakness, for a person who does not know who they are outside of their status has no foundation to stand on when that status is challenged. They are essentially a ghost haunting their own life, driven by a ghost's hunger for a substance they can no longer feel. One of the most profound ironies of the compensatory drive is that it makes the seeker exceptionally easy to manipulate. Because the individual is driven by an insatiable need for the validation of their status, their behavior becomes highly predictable to those who understand their underlying insecurity. A person who craves the appearance of power can be controlled through the simple administration or withholding of the symbols they value. By offering them a title, a seat at a particular table, or even a subtle nod of deference, others can direct their energy and focus with surgical precision. The seeker believes they are the one gaining ground, unaware that they are being led by their own vanity. Furthermore, the power seekers' hyperfixation on their image makes them blind to the subtle dynamics of influence around them. They are so focused on projecting strength that they fail to notice when they are being outmaneuvered by those who operate without the need for ego inflation. Those who are truly influential often hide their hands, allowing the power seeker to take the visible, high-friction roles while they quietly shape the outcome from the periphery. In this light, the pursuit of power is not a path to agency, but a surrender of it. The seeker becomes a predictable instrument in the hands of those who have the clarity to see through the noise of their ambition. The endgame of compensatory power is almost always an entropic collapse, as the energy required to sustain the simulation eventually exceeds the individual's psychological capacity. There comes a point where the gap between the mask and the reality becomes too wide to bridge, and the friction of the performance leads to total burnout or a public failure of composure. This collapse is rarely the result of a single external blow. Rather, it is the result of 1,000 small compromises that have eroded the individual's internal structural integrity. When the pressure finally reaches a critical mass, the facade doesn't just crack, it disintegrates, leaving the individual exposed and without the tools to navigate a world that no longer recognizes their projected status. In this moment of collapse, the seeker is forced to confront the reality that their power was never a shield, but a weight that prevented them from developing true resilience. The social circles that were built on the performance vanish, as they were never based on mutual respect, but on a shared participation in a status game. The individual is left in a state of profound disorientation, standing in the ruins of a life they built for an audience that has already moved on. The collapse is the final revelation of the seeker's fundamental weakness. They built a kingdom on the shifting sands of perception, and in the end, they are left with nothing but the silence of the void they were trying to fill. The pursuit of power is a self-negating act, because power is not a destination to be reached or a trophy to be displayed, but a byproduct of psychological integration and genuine competence. When an individual attempts to seize it through compensation, they are essentially trying to buy the shadow of a mountain without the mountain itself. True strength lies in the absence of the need to prove it. It is found in the individual who is so grounded in their own reality that they are immune to the fluctuations of the social gaze. They do not seek to command, and therefore they cannot be deposed. They do not perform, and therefore they cannot be exposed. We conclude that the desire for power is the ultimate indicator of a lack of it. To move through the world with authentic agency requires the courage to abandon the performance and embrace the friction of reality. Power is found only when the need for it is surrendered, leaving behind a presence that is quiet, immutable, and entirely self-contained. The mask is not the man, and the noise is not the signal. One must decide whether they wish to be the architect of an illusion or the master of their own silence. If you find value in this level of inquiry, we invite you to subscribe and continue the examination of the mechanisms that shape our perception and our world.